Hello, my name is Rich Sweetser. I'm part of the NORA technical research team, and today I'm here to talk to you about beneficial electrification and the nature of the threat to the heating oil industry. The topics I'd like to cover today are, we're going to talk about the challenges from electricity, what they are. We're going to talk about how this electric transformation is to be accomplished. We're going to examine electric heat pumps and compare them to boilers and furnaces. We're going to make a comparison of an electric heat pump with a liquid fueled heat pump. And we're going to talk about the impact of supply and demand of electricity from the deployment of all these electric heat pumps. One of the first things we need to understand, though, is the electric grid is about delivering two things: low-cost electricity, and also about delivering reliable electricity. And there's a built-in tension right now between the states that really want to put in a lot more intermittent renewable power, such as wind and photovoltaics, and then apply that through the wholesale electric grid, like New England ISO, and get that all to function both economically as well as reliably. So there is a bit of a tension that needs to be worked out, and it's not an insignificant issue. Nevertheless, carbon policy is driving a lot of what we're talking about today. Many of the states see completely decarbonizing the electric grid by 2050. Other states see decarbonizing all energy sources and end uses by 2050, which is a far bigger issue. And also many states look at 50% decarbonization of all energy sources and end uses by 2030. Residential heating is a key target for decarbonization, and electric heat pumps is a principal means of achieving it. So what does this mean for our industry? It means that liquid fuels industry must decarbonize or face extinction. And more importantly, it means the industry must begin significant decarbonization immediately, so that they can become part of the discussion and the dialogue for policy and not be overrun by it. If you operate in a state that is purple, dark blue, light blue, green, light green, or orange, you're operating in a state that has a renewable electric policy of some sort, and many of these states have policies aimed at residential heating. So there is an importance to all of these states, and certainly there are all the states that the heating oil industry plays in. We need to be mindful of this. Also, this transformation will be accomplished because of entities like the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, ACEEE, which is this first study that came out this June. RAP, the Regulatory Assistance Project, the middle study, which RAP is listened to by public utility commissions throughout the country, and the bottom right, which is the Rocky Mountain Research Institute, a similar study that is widely listened to by the environmental community. You take these studies and others, they make a great footprint or imprint on people that want to create policy, and that's why we have, in large part, beneficial electrification today. What's wrong with these studies? Well, first of all, they're largely academic. In other words, they don't depend on field data or they depend on academic studies. They're generally not technically correct for cold climates. They also underestimate heat pump performance, as well as the transition cost to go from oil or other fossil fuels to electric heat pumps on the cost of the homeowner. However, these are effective with policymakers unless policymakers are educated with better information. Just focusing on New England, just as an example, the New England states, if you look at this little graphic and you are on the third row, you'll see if you're in a state with a yellow dot or a green dot, these states actively today have consumer and vendor education programs about heat pump integration into residential homes. The red circles doesn't mean they haven't had in the past or they won't in the future, but there are no policy barriers, policy issues right now. Another important thing to understand about a lot of the studies, analysis, and reasons for policy change is based upon misleading data. This is an important center that's I've seen it in many of the analysis we've seen to date. And you see oil out there, and basically this is greenhouse gas emissions in tons based on basically the fuel content, the carbon content in the fuel, compared against the, in this case, the electric grid down here, which it's important to see, this is the average generation mix. Well, and adding a heat pump to that. So it's basically a furnace versus a heat pump. And we're being tagged with all the fuel and basically no biodiesel blends. No, we're not allowed to apparently use biodiesel here to show that we can reduce our carbon emissions dramatically. And on the electric side, the average mix here has a lot of non-carbon emitting technologies such as nuclear power and all the renewables and hydropower. And none of that will be displaced when you remove a oil furnace and put in an electric heat pump. It's all at the margin, and that will be, we're displacing oil-fired power, coal-fired power, and natural gas-fired power, not displacing non-emitting carbon stuff. So this example, not example, this is one of the problems we have with all of the analysis that's out there. Finally, money. Based upon all this analysis and policy and programs, money flows. And this is just an example in New England of money that's being paid to homeowners to essentially put in an electric heat pump and remove an oil furnace, oil boiler. So there's a lot afoot. Now let's switch gears and take a look at the electric heat pump. At the various highest level, the electric heat pump is all about moving heat. So here we've got a home and we're taking home air in and we are essentially cooling it in the cooling mode. And in this particular case, we're cooling mode and we're taking that heat from the indoor coil through the refrigerant circuit to the outdoor coil. And we are taking outdoor air and we're heating that outdoor air and dispensing the outdoor heat there. So in the case of the heating mode, we're basically taking heat from the outdoors, and then we are cooling it. And we're taking that heat though, moving that heat indoors, where we're taking air from the residence and we're heating that residence and bringing it back in as hot air. Very simple. Heat pump pumps heat or moves heat. This particular diagram, I'm going to skip over, but it's good there for your reference. But I'm going to walk you through the heating mode just so we all are on the same page. So again, what we're doing is we're taking outside air, and with that outside air, we are heating a liquid refrigerant, and we are cooling the outside air and delivering that cool air to the outdoors. So by doing that, we're taking this low temperature, low pressure liquid here, and we're making it a low pressure vapor. And we're going through what's called a reversing valve. So this is in the heating mode position. And that basically takes this vapor and sucks it into the compressor. And the compressor compresses it, makes it a high pressure, high temperature vapor. This high pressure, high temperature vapor then goes to the indoor coil, which is a condenser, where it absorbs heat, gives off heat to the air that's passing over it. I'll get back to that in a minute. And basically it condenses, goes from a high pressure, high temperature vapor into a high pressure, high temperature liquid. It comes back over here, goes through an expansion device and becomes a low pressure, low temperature liquid and begins the process over again. So what happens here is we're taking the air from the home and we're basically giving up the heat to the refrigerant. And in doing so, we are condensing the refrigerant and then we're absorbing heat here and making warm air go into the home. And that's the way the cycle works. Electric heat pumps that use electric efficiency measures, and they are the seasonal energy efficiency ratio and the heating seasonal performance factor. These were created when heat pumps were invented, and they were used to compare one heat pump to another. But they're not good to compare a heat pump to a furnace, and that's because they are basically output cooling and output heating versus input watt hours. So that's electricity. But we can convert those watt hours into BTUs. So if you take those watt hours and make them BTUs down here, you've got BTUs of heating or cooling divided by BTUs of electricity. Or if metric, we can do kilowatts of thermal, kilowatts of electricity. Taking that, we can compare to a boiler or furnace efficiency using COP. However, again, electricity is not primary fuel. It is an intermittent form of power. So we have to convert then the heat pump energy into primary energy to get it right. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, 61% of the conversion of energy is used during conversion, that's during generation, and 5% through transmission and distribution losses. So that means 34% is the efficiency of the electricity that is delivered to the heat pump. Similarly, though, when you make ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, 14% of the primary energy is used to produce, refine, and deliver the fuel. So that's ultra-low sulfur diesel can be considered 86% efficient as far as being delivered. So let's take a quick look at the performance of a single-speed heat pump. We start here with the heat pump capacity, and the heat pump capacity is reduced with ambient temperature. Here's ambient temperature. So your heat pump capacity is reduced at 47 degrees. That's the rating point. So you see it's 100%. That's 100% of your capacity at the design point. Continues, goes down through as the temperature falls. Now, the home heating load does the opposite. Here I'm at 65. It could be 60, 65 degrees as far as your starting point when you start heating your home. So these, as you reduce the ambient temperature, you reach the crossover point with the capacity, and that's called the balance point. And then the load continues as you reduce the temperature. So what happens is you end up creating an area here that is where supplemental heating is required. If you don't add supplemental heating here, the temperature in the house will continue to fall. You can't keep up. Also, it's important to note that the heat pump COP also declines with ambient temperature. So when you do a seasonal COP performance, it's not what you get at the rated point, it's what you get as you go through the actual seasonal performance. I do want to spend a minute on the defrost cycle, because under certain ambient conditions, temperature and relative humidity, frost can and will form on the coil, and that must be removed because it really just it tremendously reduces the heat transfer characteristics of that coil. So what happens is automatically, and it's sensed automatically with a sensor, the reversing valve switches over and changes the operation of the indoor coil, which was the condenser, becomes the evaporator, and the outdoor coil, which is the evaporator, becomes the condenser. And in both cases, both fans are stopped so that you're not moving. You're allowing more heat into the outdoor coil, and you're not allowing cold air to pass through the home, air conditioned air to pass through the home. And what happens is that stays in that state until it reaches about 57 degrees Fahrenheit, which it's deemed at that point then that most of the frost is gone, and then everything stops and then reverses again and goes back into the heating mode. So you're basically using energy to defrost, not to heat the home. And in some cases, you're clearly adding cooling to the coil system. Indoors, it must be removed, and you may even use some electricity to actually try and heat that coil up. There's also different schemes going on, but it's in an inefficient operating mode. And here you can see from the Minnesota for Energy and Environment. I've used this field study because it's the only field study I know that has enough data to make comparative analysis. So you can see this actually is a plot of 8760 hours. Each one of these is an hour of operation. So you can see all the heat pump operation here. And so you can see the heat pump here operating roughly from, this is 60 degrees down, and it stops operating somewhere around, roughly around 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is where you get heat pump operation. Interestingly, this is your defrost cycle. Now these are hour increments. So you will see the way the defrost drops the the performance. And this down here happens to be a furnace, a propane furnace that was used as a backup heating as you drop down from roughly 10 degrees down below that ambient temperature. So you get to see how real performance of the way a heat pump system works with backup heating in a cold climate. What we were able to do is we were able to take that data and we were able to plot the performance by temperature bins. So from essentially 60 degrees down to 0 degrees temperature bins, we were able to plot from the performance data given in this field study the seasonal performance the performance by bins, and you can see how the performance of the heat pump falls off by bins. Now, taking that data, we can then take bin data from these different cities, and we can tell you what the seasonal performance of that heat pump would be, depending upon how cold the ambient temperatures are. So you can see this is the seasonal performance. Then if you go back to the primary energy conversion of 34%, we can take that 34% against these COPs and create this efficiency performance that's now we can compare to essentially a furnace. So basically what this looks at is this is a comparative for 92% efficient AFU furnace for primary energy basis. This is an 86% on primary energy basis. And you can see that the 92% is virtually the same, particularly in the colder climates, as the electric heat pump in actual performance data. So let's move on. Let's compare a liquid fueled heat pump and see what that will do. This is the liquid fuel heat pump that we're working with. It's from a company called SMTI, and this is a ammonia water absorption heat pump. And how it operates is very simple. This is your vapor compression cycle, where you have your evaporator, your condenser, your expansion device, a motor, and a compressor. And you have the same elements in the liquid fueled absorption heat pump, with the exception of we have a thermal compressor. Instead of the motor and the actual compressor, we have a desorber, which takes in, this is where heat comes in. This is where we actually use a burner in the desorber. We have an expansion valve here. We have a desorber, and we have a small pump. And this is how the system works. This actually gives off heat here, very similar to what happens over here. Now, there are some differences. If you look at the heat pump design, it has end-use COPs. Remember, using electricity of 3 to 3.5. And again, if you take that in primary energy terms, it's a lot less than that. The thermal heat pump has 1.4 to 2. Remember, if we deliver fuel at 86%, that's a lot different than delivering electricity at 34%. Interestingly enough, though, for a heating side, the heating side is 1.1 times the cooling side. Now, this can reverse, but there are some reasons why we're not doing that right now. But the heating side is 2.5 times the cooling side. So you get a lot more heating performance out of this device than you do out of the electric heat pump. So interesting to note. If you look at a constant speed electric heat pump from a capacity side, again, this is that same capacity curve. It goes down with temperature, and the liquid fueled heat pump is a lot flatter as far as capacity. So it has a whole different characteristic. So what I did was I took that same curve same graph that we had before, and I added to it a primary energy based thermal heat pump, and you can see where it fits now versus the heat pump we measured out of that Minnesota study. It is significantly better. I'm going to switch one more time on you on the implications on supply and demand. Again, I want to go back and use ISO New England as an example. This is their projected, and I want you to remember 661 megawatts to the winter peak for heating electrification through heat pumps. And they're basically saying between now and 2030, it's going to increase their load on their grid, 661 megawatts. Now, I did a back of the envelope calculation that I thought was interesting. I took from, again, EIA, US EIA, the oil used for residential purposes in each state. This is the amount of gallonage in their 2018 data, latest I could get. Then I looked at EIA again and used their calculations for the percent for residential use between heating and domestic hot water. And in this case, for example, 75% was used for heating, 78% main was used for heating versus hot water. Then I took a typical seasonal COP based upon the Minnesota data for performance for the electric heat pump. And through that, I got megawatt hours. Then I added typical operating hours per year. From that, I got average kilowatt hours. And then I added, from the average kilowatt hour, I added 50% of that to get a peak demand number. And if you add all this up, that's 12,000 megawatts of peak potential if you convert all the oil heated homes to electric heat pumps. Now remember, New England ISO says they're going to talk about 661 megawatts. Just for reference, this is New England ISO's 2019-2020, they call it weather-adjusted daily gross peak loads. And sir, their weather-adjusted peak load is 23,000 megawatts, 23,173. If you convert all the oil-heated homes, that's 12,000. That's a big change. So there's some real interesting impact implications on how you do that. Even how you do 661 megawatts, if you have to deal with where the electricity is coming from and where it's flowing to. What do you have to upgrade, and who's going to pay for it? So in summary, the heating oil industry must decarbonize or it will be eliminated. That is clear. And equally importantly, we must pivot now, changing to low carbon fuels immediately, so we can be part of the dialogue rather than be run over by public policy. Based on field test performance in cold climates, a 92% AFU oil heated appliance is virtually comparable on a primary energy air basis with a constant speed air to air electric heat pump. And this does not consider supplemental heating. That was just heat pump performance. Heating electrification through heat pumps is forecasted by ISO New England to contribute 661 megawatts. If you do my back of the envelope calculation, and they do a lot more, it's going to be a lot bigger. And who's going to pay for all of this capital cost infrastructure? NORA is working on a thermally driven heat pump that will be significantly more efficient on a primary energy basis than electric heat pumps. And the industry has low carbon biodiesel and the potential of no carbon and even negative carbon fuels in the future. I want to leave you with this: the future of liquid low and no carbon economic, storable, resilient, comfortable residential heating fuel appliances is really up to you. With that, I thank you for your attention.